Good evening, everyone, and welcome to ReggieCon's panel on Mutant and Proud, Diversity in the World of X-Men. This is the fifth in our six-part series of ReggieCon panels at Illinois State University. My name is Amelia Noel Elkins, and I am the Interim Assistant Vice President for Student Success at Illinois State. We are thrilled tonight to join in the celebration of Diversity Month through this conversation about X-Men. Before we begin the panel, just a few details to keep everything running smoothly for all of you in the audience. Please know that this session is being recorded and will be archived on the ReggieCon website. Also, if you need confirmation that you attended tonight's ReggieCon event, we will post a link to a form for you to submit a request for confirmation of attendance in the chat later in the evening. While the presenters' audio and video are on, we cannot hear or see any guests. However, we will be monitoring the Q&A function, so we encourage you to ask questions of the presenters. After some discussion, our panelists will be taking some questions from the attendees. Also, we'd like to invite you to visit the ReggieCon website at illinoisstate.edu/ReggieCon to find ReggieCon merchandise and for information about all of our ReggieCon panels. A portion of the proceeds from ReggieCon merchandise sales will be donated to the Red and White Fund to benefit Illinois State students in financial need. And our next ReggieCon panel will occur in May. In recognition of Asian Pacific Heritage Month, ReggieCon will focus on the co-founder of Studio Ghibli, Hayao Miyazaki. We hope that these panels can provide a foundation for a live and in-person ReggieCon in the future. At this time, I'm pleased to introduce our moderator and panelist for this discussion of X-Men, Dr. Scott Jordan, who is professor and chair of psychology at Illinois State University. Scott, I'll hand it over to you to introduce yourself and the rest of the panelists.
Thank you, Dr. Noel Elkins, and welcome everyone to ReggieCon, the con that asks the question, what's your story? Well, I'm Dr. Scott Jordan, aka Zombie Scotty, cognitive psychologist philosopher here at Illinois State University. And before we get into our discussion of X-Men, I just have to say it's been a tough week. There's the case of Caron Nazario, the Army lieutenant, who was assaulted by a police officer amid the ongoing murder trial of Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd. The list goes on, with Dante Wright being shot by police during a traffic stop. And then today, a video of the murder of Adam Toledo, a 13-year-old boy shot by police in Chicago. We want to acknowledge the time and space in which we are hosting this event and send our thoughts out to the families of the victims and those marginalized communities that have been targets of hate and violence. Now, I'd like to quickly thank the people who make ReggieCon possible. No, that's not working. All right, we'll do it this way. I'd like to thank Dr. Amelia Noah Elkins, Dr. Jana Albrecht, Ms. Somer Simmons, Mr. Sean Thornton, who does all of this fantastic artwork, and Miss Danny Schroeder. So tonight we discuss and celebrate Diversity Month with a discussion of Mutant and Proud, diversity in the world of X-Men, with none other than award-winning longtime running author of the X-Men comic, Mr. Chrsi Claremont. Joining me on the ReggieCon panel is the one, the only Dr. Teresa Rojas. Teresa, please tell the audience what you do and tell us your favorite X-Men memory.
Hi, I'm Dr. Chrsi Rojas, and I am a professor of English and professor of ethnic studies at Modesto Junior College in Modesto, California, which is in the Central Valley. I'm also the director of the Latinx Comic Arts Festival here. And favorite X-Men moment has to be having to do with the film, the 2000 film, which was my introduction to X-Men. So it definitely has a special place for me. And as much as I appreciated seeing so many strong women in superhero roles in the film, no one ever gets a first time with Hugh Jackman as Wolverine. So that was, that's memorable and very special for me. But I also have to admit for the first time ever that I have always had a boarding school fantasy. You can interpret that however you like, in hopes probably of getting away from my family. So I thought the idea of a boarding school that would help me hone and develop my superhero powers, whatever those were, just seemed absolutely fantastic. So I was very, very excited to see that on film. And my favorite character, actually, other than Wolverine, was Mystique. I thought she was an incredible badass.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Please keep your camera on. And also on the ReggieCon crew, the hardest working man in comics, Mr. Victor Dandridge Jr. Victor, please tell us what you do and your favorite X-Men memory.
Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Victor Dandridge, self-publishing comic book creator from Columbus, Ohio. I self-published through my imprint, Vantage and House Productions. I am also the new editor-in-chief of Wizard Magazine. In addition to all of that, I am a fervent comic book reader and reviewer through the comic book, or the Black, White, and Red All Over comic book review show. And I also teach, which I'm currently doing right now, which is kind of amazing, through my You Create Comics line. I have a artist residency with a local charter school teaching young minds how to use comics for their own empowerment. If we're going for my favorite X-Men opportunity, I actually have to pull from the animated series, but in deference to our great guest, it was the Phoenix Saga, and getting to experience that in the weekly incarnation that it was coming out. That was a huge event, and it was kind of insane because my father would record them for me so that we could literally rewatch episodes until we had the entire series. And that was the penultimate storytelling, big, huge hype, cosmic story, character, like bonanza. It was fantastic.
Oh, that's fantastic. I actually loved watching that series as well. Also on the ReggieCon crew, my friend, colleague, and partner in crime in all things nerdy, the one, the only Dr. Eric Wesselman. Eric, please tell everybody what you do and your favorite X-Men memory.
So I'm an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at ISU. I'm a social psychologist who focuses on studying the dynamics of social inclusion and exclusion in everyday life. It's really hard for me to pick just one X-Men memory. I read my first issue of X-Men when I was 9 or 10, so I was introduced to Mr. Claremont's run early in my life. I've been hooked ever since. I've been fortunate to start working the X-Men into my teaching. I've taught a couple seminars on psychology and comic books. 2 of those seminars are specifically focused on the X-Men. Mr. Claremont was kind enough to visit one of those classes last fall. What I love the most about the X-Men is that no matter who you are, there's a character there for you to connect with. The team rosters have characters from various identity categories and backgrounds. And further, the core psychological themes, at least the way I see them, in these stories focus around the search for belonging and identity. And these are 2 things that we all need in our lives and can identify with.
Thank you so much, Eric. That was very well said. And now, ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce tonight's special guests. We begin with the amazing, I really love chatting with her, the one, the only Dr. Leandra Paris. Leandra, please tell us what you do and your favorite X-Men memory.
So I'm Dr. Leandra Paris. I am a professor of school psychology at William & Mary, so I'm out Virginia. So Victor, you stole my favorite memory. Saturday morning.
I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. So I think my first experience with X-Men was actually my stepmom buying me House of M because she saw me getting so into the Saturday morning comics, and I kept talking about how powerful the women were and how much I loved Phoenix. And so she went and got the only thing that was at the store in this little town that we grew up in. So that was kind of my foray into it. So I hold that memory very dear. I think that I can attribute my experience with X-Men as my passion for diversity and for social justice. And that kind of all came fruition when I was in a hotel room at a conference with a fellow graduate student when I was in graduate school. And she had just come out and she had a lot of intersecting identities. And she was talking about feeling isolated and like not really seeing herself and culture and in the movies and things. And I was like, no, hold up. And I told her about Uncanny X-Men. I told her about Mystique, Iceman. Like, I brought up all of them and I could just see her eyes lighting up that there was a story out there for her. And that really solidified, I think, and capped my experiences with X-Men in terms of just that growth and that belonging, as Dr. Wesselman said. So.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. And now for our next special guest, the Doctor of Comics, AKA Brother Story, the one, the only Dr. Stanford Carpenter. Stanford, please tell us what you do and your favorite X-Men memory.
Yes, hello, I'm Dr. Stanford Carpenter. I'm a cultural anthropologist coming to you out of Chicago, Illinois. I mean, there's no better time than the first time. One of the earliest comic books that I read was All New, All Different X-Men '98, and what fascinated me was just the opening. I mean, you know, it was written by Chrsi Claremont. It was illustrated by Dave Cockrum, and it was the one that starts off where they're in Rockefeller Center. It's around Christmas, and the Sentinels show up, and just these giant monsters coming in, and the way each character is just quickly introduced, you know, and seeing these characters that are just vastly different, and seeing one character in particular who so represented my experiences at the time living in I would say a mostly white suburb, but since our family was the only Black family, it was pretty much an all white suburb, and actually having this book where there are just all these amazing characters, and there's one character in particular I latched onto. Most people expect me to say Storm, but it was actually Nightcrawler. And for even though his image inducer turned him into, you know, Errol Flynn, there's something about Nightcrawler and his struggle to fit in, to even fit in amongst mutants that that gave me solace, and that gave me an immense amount of joy in feeling like my Black experience was represented.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Stanford. And before we introduce tonight's extremely special guest, I want to share my favorite memory. One of these days when they do build the quantum bubble and we can all actually see each other at the same point in time in the past, and we will all see each other watching the animated series on the same Saturday mornings, right? Decades apart in age, I might add. But I had a bit of that experience. Eric was a graduate student, an undergraduate and a graduate student here at Illinois State University. And when he was doing his PhD at Purdue, I visited him. And see, I grew up watching the X-Men all by myself, right? And I kept it to myself. There was no nerd crowd around. Anyway, I'm in Eric's house and he's just got all this X-Men stuff. And I said, oh man, you watch this too? And of course I was excited, but what was really cool, his wife was totally excited that I actually watched the X-Men as well. And then we just had this wonderful conversation about, oh, but they deal with the most intense social issues. It's so fantastic. So for me, that was a quantum time loop that was actually linear, but nonetheless, it felt like I was walking through time to get there. Okay, so now it's time to introduce our extremely special guest. And to do so, I want to introduce Eric again. Eric was able to go get some Sage Trust funds in order to sponsor Chris's presentation tonight. So Eric, please.
So, and now, ladies and gentlemen, the longtime author of the X-Men, winner of a double-digit number of awards, including the Inkpot Award, the Eagle Award, and the Charles Flint Kellogg Award. The one, the only, please stand if you can, and welcome Mr. Chrsi Claremont.
Oh my God.
So Chris, your favorite X-Men memory? I know that's not a fair question. And some of our responses tonight can be your actual favorite experience, if you like. But seriously, your favorite X-Men experience?
Well, this is where I'm conflicted. Partly because, at least as far as I'm concerned, I don't call them X-Men anymore, because after, God help me, the better part of 50 years, it seems silly, considering the number of non-men there are, considering the number of non-human. So I've started just calling them the X.
Mm,
You know,
that's fantastic.
well, no, it's just me being a brat. And continuing in that theme, I'm afraid for me, my favorite X-Men is always the undiscovered country of the story I haven't written yet.
Mm,
If the story is in print, if it's done, it's out of my control. It's for the reader to analyze. And the problem is, every time I come up with a favorite, there's always, well, what about this? What about that? I mean, you know, it's like, gosh, we love the story where Kitty comes into the X-Men right after Jean's funeral, where we thought those things lasted forever. And yet I find myself thinking of the moments that I'm fondest of, which is where in the middle of her miniseries, where she's back at the University of Chicago going for her master's, every issue was spent 2 pages with her having therapy, and me having to figure out what psychologists actually do for a living.
You've come to the right place.
Well, no, but I mean, that's it. It's not dealing with
right
superheroes in terms of bending steel with bare hands. It's dealing with how you cope with the real world when your natural state is to be intangible, and to get solid enough to open a door takes an active work of focus and will. You may do it automatically after practice, but you still have to do it. It's looking at all the characters and define it in comics, and trying to define them in terms that are relevant to the world we powerless folk live in, and seeing what inspirations come of it. I mean, the thing is, with an average comic, you only have 100 images.
Right.
So the writer has to synergize with the artist. We have to get a beginning, a middle, an end, and keep the reader's attention focused on it for that amount of time. And it's both fun and ridiculously challenging. But if you get to do it right, if you come up with characters that, if I fall in love with them as the author, hopefully the audience will fall in love with them in turn, and then we all go crazy together.
That's fantastic.
And that's why I live in a world where I prefer to get paid by the word, because I cannot shut up. My apologies.
No, that's okay. I'm going to ask the other panelists if you would go ahead and open your mics, so we just have room for spontaneous oohs and ahs as we go through this. What we're going to do is I'm going to ask Leandra to ask a question. Chris, you answer, and then the crew and the group will talk about it for a bit, and then when that's finished, we'll go to Stanford. So we're planning on having basically about 2 questions with long conversation, and we can always come up with more if we need it. So I'm going to start with Leandra. Leandra, what's your question?
So first, it's great to meet you. When Eric told me this, I literally had like a glitch and was like staring, and Eric was like, "Are you okay?" And I was like, "What?" So thank you so much for joining us. So my question actually goes back to part of what Eric or Scott had opened with in terms of where we are right now in the world and the horrific things that have been happening. So in God Loves, Man Kills, it starts well, not the extended edition, but the original starts with the frame of the killing of the 2 Black children. And then later, part of the conflict is resolved by a white police officer protecting the X and kind of being the voice of reason. And so I kind of want to get your thoughts on your choice behind those two frames, as well as how you would want readers to put that together in light of the current world.
Well, there are a whole lot of different aspects of this. I'm an immigrant. Worse, I'm an immigrant from England, which is both partly cool and partly pejorative. But speaking in terms of police interaction, my memories are of a police that, rough and brutish as they were, did not carry lethal weapons. They didn't carry guns. This is, bear in mind, this is a while ago. Things are evolving in a different direction. But the idea over here of this sort of almost Wild West shootout mentality that's carried over into a modern urban setting has always been a little disconcerting. One looked at police and never actually imagined, you saw the gun, but never actually imagined them using it. But there's a moment when I was a kid, we were driving, sounds silly, but through the heartland. My father at that point was in the Army, and I think we were driving to Denver where he was taking up his next post. And we're stopped somewhere in the South. And I'm sitting there, we're having a burger, and there's a uniformed officer at the counter. And I'm like 4 or 5, and I walked over and just I plucked his gun out of his holster and said, "Bang, bang."
Oh no.
I was a kid, I was white, it was the 50s. And I'm both facetious and serious. And he just like freaked out. He was not happy, but nothing, as far as I can recall, and as far as my mother will tell me, nothing more happened. But that was 1950s America. Had I not been who I was and where I came from, who knows how it would have gone. So what I find myself, how I find myself reacting over the past year, if not the past decade, in terms of these ever increasing accidents, it's frustrating and despairing, because in a comic story, there are rules. Because the writer, the crowd, defines them. Everybody has a role, everybody behaves themselves. In real life, they don't. And the problem is drawing a weapon instinctively almost mandates the use. Otherwise, why do you have it out in the first place? And to be unable to differentiate which weapon you are drawing, gun, stunner, phaser, whatever, the problem is the differentiation between what a rookie might do, what an officer of some years experience might do, what an officer of 20 plus years experience might do. You try to find a way to understand it, but the problem is the minute the trigger's pulled, invariably somebody dies. And you can't, that's something that cannot be taken back. And I suppose that the whole point in something like God Loves is the differentiation between those who use weapons as a means of terror and a person who uses the weapon responsibly in the upholding of the law, defense of society. And the fact at the end that Stryker leads into that moment by, well, Kitty leads into the moment by saying, I'd rather stand with Nightcrawler than with you because he's more human than you are. And Stryker's response is, you call that thing human? Mm. And he's, you know, in any other circumstance, people would say he's about to kill a monster. Go for it. And there's Kitty standing, you know, it's like she can't stop the bullet. I mean, Nightcrawler can teleport out of the way, but who can tell where the bullet will go after that? But that the officer was willing to make a judgment call and prevent the Stryker from pulling his trigger. For me, at that time, it was an expression of hope that the forces that society chose to protect itself in a grand scheme, not just a neighborhood, not just a block, not just a color, not just a race, everybody, without exception or differentiation. That was the point. It was an act of heroism on the part of the officer. But that's the whole point of the story. You come to an end where, thank heaven, the right thing was done, the day was saved, and yet the conflict, Magneto versus Charlie, their visions of the world, their visions of how the world needs to be dealt with, that hasn't changed. And Magneto, from experience, is the utter pessimist. And Charlie, because of what he's endured, because of what his students are expressing to him, has to hold on to hope. I mean, that was the whole point Louise Simonson and I started out with that story, because our idea was a graphic novel was exactly what it was supposed to be. If you only have one X-Men story to read in your entire life, that's it. It exemplifies, encompasses who these people are, why they are, what the conflict is between them and humanity, well, between them and the rest of humanity, forgive me. It has nothing to do with superpowers. It has everything to do with difference. It's like, in my vision, my future history of the X-Men, the whole point, Kitty is the 50th president of the United States, and her whole point is, I'm not the first woman, I'm not the first mutant president or super president, but I am a first. And as tactfully as I could, because I guess I'm the generation that was bred to be discreet, if not cowardly. She's the first gay president. And her and Rachel. And my point is that was and is, and I guess forever will be, this is a series about inclusion, about the need for inclusion, the positivity of inclusion, and the sheer stark terror inclusion awakens in the half the country that aren't ready for it.
It's fantastic. Do any of the panelists want to follow up on Chris's comment? Go ahead, just jump on.
I do. what I do appreciate, obviously, is Chris, when you said that when you put a book out into the wild, basically it no longer belongs to you; it belongs to the readership, and how they see it is as much truth as whatever you put into it. And I have to admit, like, from the perspective of, you know, an under 40 young Black male, it's very interesting to hear your intention of the officer, whereas how, based on my cultural historic, you know, background, I see something different. And what's amazing to me is not that there is opposition, it's just a stranger perspective, if you will. This is an officer that had already witnessed Stryker killing someone, and yet waited until he was about to kill someone again before he enacted any sort of judicious decision, which I think is so very, you know, interesting. It feeds into a cultural perspective that a person that looks like me has in a sense of distrust, and where clearly, like, what he did was heroic. But then we get into the conversation of the timing of the heroics, the, you know, implication or the catalyst of the heroics. You know, here was a woman that he clearly just killed, and for what everyone else knew, this was just a woman that he pushed off stage, you know, who was supposed to be with him. You know, granted, upon reading it, we know, like, there was this inner turmoil that, you know, latently she has some mutant ability and it was being revealed. But here's this officer who is now choosing to act after a whole sequence of events have occurred that, based on their role as an officer, should have prompted him to act judiciously long before Scott said anything, before they destroyed the machine that Xavier was, you know, attached to. And it's there's a beauty to it, you know, to hear what you intended, and then to see how, per my own experience, I get something different, but neither one of us are wrong. And I think that's beautiful.
Well, I think my rationale would be Madison Square Garden is very big.
Very true.
And a 38 police special sucks as a long-range weapon. And, you know, there's 50,000 people around him, and he, you know, it's being in the right place at the right time. And again, that's the authors get to cheat. And you go for, you want a moment. Also, I think if it were if I were filming it, it would be a much quicker and more chaotic scene. I mean, the thing that writers and artists have to remember is that we're dealing with a sequence of still images that the reader can craft into active motion visuals in their head. But in that way, it's a synergy between myself and the artist. Well, me in that case, in that instance, Brett Anderson, crafting these spot images, and then you or every other reader filling in the gaps, the space between the panels, which, as I keep saying at panels and classes, this is the reader's, that's where the reader gets to play, because anything can happen in that space. But yeah, if I could film it, it would be a much quicker, more chaotic moment. The scene with Kitty and Nightcrawler challenging Stryker would be a matter of maybe 15, 20 seconds. You could have a cutaway showing the officer trying to get into the right position where where the people around him were not at risk, and he had a clear shot. None of which ever happens in real life.
Right.
You know, in real life, things just happen. In fiction, you can choreograph. And I think that is the most seminal, heartbreaking difference between reality and fiction, is that in one, you always get do-overs. You can always go back and retweet the moment, focus, twist it, make sure that what happens is what has the most dramatic effectiveness, whereas the other is just plain real life. And the heartbreaking effectiveness comes from watching something that cannot be undone.
Right,
or
the
redone.
finality of it.
And it's, and again, you sit there and as forgive the term, as the audience, and you say, why are we arguing? You're standing on the guy's neck. How can you not tell the difference between a stun gun? I mean, is the moment so full of panic or so full of whatever that A, B, and C happens? You know, sadly, the fundamental difference between fiction, between comics and reality is time. You can read a panel at your own leisure. You can, the use of your imagination to craft the scene into a form of reality is at your pace. Reality isn't. Something happens and your body acts before your consciousness catches up with you.
Yep.
And suddenly the gun goes off. And that's why sometimes you have moments where officers fire 15, 20, 40 shells in a matter of seconds, minutes. And other times it's just one. But you can't go back, no matter how hard you may wish. And that's I guess why I said that the opening thing is, in my memory, the difference of my childhood in a country where officers didn't carry lethal weaponry versus here, which tends to pattern itself longingly after, the OK Corral or marshals out on the open plains.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly follow up on what the issue that Victor raised. The biggest surprise I had reading God Loves Man Kills again was I was surprised by the police frames where the police were saying, I think this guy's crazy. Are you guys really listening to what these guys? I was like, oh, if we did a favorite frame, that would be mine, because it was like, oh, that's cool. And that reveals something about the time, in which you wrote it. Anyone else?
Everybody, sorry.
No, please go ahead.
The thing is, it doesn't matter what clothes you wear. You have to find a way to get the reader underneath the person's skin. Just because someone wears a blue suit and carries a Glock, that doesn't make them any more or less human. They are a person. You have to understand them as a person. By the same token, if you're going to put Magneto on stage, I mean, that's why a little later I had him actually go on trial before the World Court. You have to understand where he's coming from and where he's going, not as a supervillain, but as a person who's made choices. By the same token, you have to put that same analysis, put Charles Xavier to that same analysis. You have to put Scott to that same analysis. You've got to put, well, okay, Mr. Sinister, forget about it. But
yeah.
No, but I mean, if they're not people, if they're not fundamentally people, then why should the audience care? And if the audience doesn't care, why should they come back? And that, I'm totally solipsistic in that regard. I want everybody to come back from issue to issue, because I want this, I want them to have fun for their investment, and B, I got to pay my mortgage.
There you go. Absolutely. We're going to move on to Stanford's question. Stanford,
Sorry.
Please. No, it's all good. It's Stanford. We're all on time. Stanford, go ahead, please.
Well, I mean, what's interesting about what you've just said is it it actually changes my question a little bit, to be honest.
Mm.
So one thing that's always interested me about just the superhero genre is that it's, in some ways, it's very American. It's built on this idea that that if you give an individual power, right, and they have no loyalty, you know, like an individual with power will not be corrupted if they're good. That you know, and that to me what a superhero is. You know, the phrase "with great power there comes great responsibility." It's all in there, right? And when I read comics, a lot of times that's what I see. I see individuals grappling with power, and that's also where it becomes very fantastical for me, because I'm like, yeah, it can sometimes be hard. Now, what's interesting to me about X-Men is that I don't see quite as much of that, in part because these identity narratives are so strong and so pronounced. And then to give a little more context, you know, quite a few years ago, I spoke with Len Wein about like when they're first putting together, you know, what would become the all new, all different Uncanny X-Men. And one of the things that sticks out most in my memory was he was talking about how they were very much trying to kind of create a mutant version of Blackhawks, right? Where you have different characters from different countries, right? Different international countries. You know, and when I went back and read the comics, that's kind of what I saw in the first couple of issues. And then when you came on, you just took it straight whole hog into identity, right? We get Kitty Pryde, we get a Magneto. There's a Holocaust survivor. We have a lot more metaphors about the LGBTQ community and about race. I find it entertaining that people think that the X-Men all along had a Martin Luther King, Malcolm X dichotomy built within Professor Xavier and Magneto's relationship, when it's something that you introduced. You know, I really would like to hear more from you about what made you, was there something specific that made you decide to go in that direction, away from the focus on power that many of the other comics had, and having a heightened emphasis on identity and relationship power?
Great question.
Power's boring. No, I'm not actually being facetious. It's just partly my perception of the team has always been that they are young. They are kids, barely 20s. And the way Dave Cockrum and I ended up crafting it, Colossus was maybe 18 or 19, not to mention being a Soviet. Nightcrawler, maybe 20. Aurora, well, that was cheating on my part because I gave her my birthday. So she's 25 when I came in. But she'd been living on a mountaintop in Kenya, which to any native Kenyan would have like, what the Dickens? Dude, we are civilized here, sort of. Then the interesting irony is that Len's concept of Wolverine was that he was this smart-ass teenager, and the claws are part of his gloves. Mm-hmm. And what happened with Dave and I is that we were looking at the way Dave was drawing him and talking and thinking, wait, he's a captain in the Canadian Army? Yes. Or the Canadian military. 18-year-olds generally don't get to be captains. Right. So he's older. Right. How old? Well, and then we went the other direction. It's like, if he has a healing factor, maybe that can make him really old and nobody notices. And then the thing that grossed me out completely was Dave's brilliant inspiration to have the claws be part of it. Because, as he put it, if you make him part of the gloves, then somebody will steal the gloves and he can be Wolverine. It's the same problem that Tony Stark faces as Iron Man. Anyone can wear the armor. And after that, who cares? Whereas we wanted people to fall in love with the characters. The point for me was, at that point, especially in the Marvel universe, everybody else was grown up. They were mature people. And there was no real effective possibility for them to be jackasses. And I use the term literally because Reed was the defining aspect of the FF. He's an old guy dating a very young Sue Storm, which is creepy, but we won't go into that. Thor is the god of thunder. Peter Parker was a young, I mean, the thing that defined Marvel, Stan's conception of Peter Parker, is that his whole life is defined by the selfish act of ignoring the robber, who then turns out to be the man who kills Uncle Ben. I'm not going to get involved. It's not my job. You could have stopped him. I'm just a guy in a funny suit. I don't do that. That's the origin of With Great Power Comes Great Responsibility, because it started out with Peter, like any sensible New Yorker. I don't want to get involved, dude. He's got a gun. What am I, a superhero? Oh wait, yes, I am. No one else had that question or that conflict. And he's in high school. That, to me, that crystallized a lot of aspects of the presentation of character. And the thing I realized is that, the original 5 X-Men, they'd all grown up. They weren't kids anymore. Scott was okay, maybe college, probably grad school. Jean, probably the same. But they're old school. The new characters, epitomized 36 issues later by Kitty, are young. They don't know the rules. They're learning. They're from different places around the globe. Living in New York, it gives them a chance to find a chance of integrating into the world, but they're doing it as strangers. There's a scene that John Byrne and I did where Aurora goes back to the house she remembers from babyhood, where her parents lived when her father was a reporter based in New York before he got the foreign assignment that took them to Cairo. And the house is now a crack house because that was what was happening in the city in the late 70s when I was writing those issues. But the point is, it's a struggle to find who we are, where we belong, and what do we do with these abilities. And if we, with the X-Men, it ended up being easy because, well, you got to save the universe. First you do it with Jean, then you do it against Jean, and then you go off and fight the Brood. But between that, I try to have little moments where we bring all this really cool stuff down to a human level. Because the one thing I never understand about more contemporary books is I always looked on it as people trying to live normal lives, but what's the but? Well, I got these superpowers, as opposed to, well, I have to go off and fight for the country. I'm a nuclear physicist and I have to save the world. I'm Dr. Fauci and I've got to save the world. These are just kids. These are young folks that didn't bargain for this. They want to find a way to live a normal life. The question then is, what is a normal life? Well, I don't think anybody knows that answer, but let's take them in that direction. The key here is, to me, is you put them in normal situations. You put them as often as possible with normal people. Why? So they can ask and answer questions that we all ask and try to find an answer for. And then we take it a step into the ridiculous and put it in a super person context. But it's all about people. It has to be all about people, because otherwise it's just, you're just running around the same track over and over and over again.
No, that's fantastic.
You know,
Teresa,
this has me thinking quite a bit about, to be perfectly honest, so this was my first time reading this particular volume, and I'm traumatized. Just so you know,
I'm so sorry.
Traumatized from the first page, but in a good way, if that's possible. In that, well, the opening. So I really wanted to get your thoughts on the opening and just like how you chose, to write about this opening, because it's very difficult, to jump into it. I always think in terms, kind of like Eric, of teaching to a class. Like, what can I teach for my class? What can I grab? And there's so much to talk about just in the first few pages of this book. And I don't know why I had trouble remembering the title there. God Loves, Man Kills, right? Because I think of it backwards, actually, because the book opens with man killing. And so I keep wanting to say it backwards, and it sort of ends with love, with notes about love. But just this idea of, if I remember correctly, they were running. Is it Mark and Jill? They're running, and they don't know why, but they're running.
Well, their parents have been killed, presumably, and they're running for their lives, and they don't make it.
And then this idea of purification, and what's coming after them is purification. And there's that scene right after they're murdered, when they're strung up on the playground. And I mean, that's a lynching, right? This is essentially a lynching scene.
Yeah.
And how dramatic and traumatic that is. And the other thing that I didn't notice the first time around is that it's a woman who kills them. And that's even more stark. So I'm like, what? I'm like trying to get past the first 5 pages, and I'm like, no, I got to go read that again. So I'm really interested in, and you as a writer, in building those scenes, and kind of what's involved in building those scenes and thinking those through, and making those kinds of rhetorical choices.
Well, partly and practically, it was to demonstrate that this was a story and a book that is not governed by the Comics Code. We are taking the conflict that we sort of dance around in the regular stories and presenting it in as visceral a way as possible. And I suppose the other aspect was, this wasn't funny. This was, I mean, it's just, it sounds weird saying it, but at that point I'd lived through 3 assassinations.
Yep.
I mean, it's, sitting in class in junior high school and somebody running in and saying the president's been shot, and we're saying, get out of here. And then it was true. The not only the moment of Martin Luther King's assassination, but the extraordinary moment of listening to Bobby's response to it, and realizing after the fact that was the only city in the United States that didn't go up in flames that that weekend, because he just stood there and said, he spoke in terms that his audience, which was mostly Black, understood viscerally, and understood from the terms that he was speaking from his own knowledge, having buried his brother, who'd been, and then going to bed thinking, holy cow, Bobby's going to this is going to be cool. He's going to go to Chicago and just take over, and waking up and, 5 hours later and he's dead. And it's, I spent 6 months listening to Sunday morning evangelicals, which, trust me, in those days were nowhere near as high-powered, polished billionaires as they are today. These are guys in tents down in the South, Oral Roberts and everyone else. And trying to figure out, and reading the whole Bible myself, and trying to figure out why the words can say one thing and these guys can say the same words and mean something totally different. Old Testament I can understand because that's blood and thunder. New Testament, supposedly a better way, and yet look at all that's happened in
its name.
In its name, thank you.
Well said.
And it's feeling angry and feeling frustrated and feeling, why don't they understand? Why don't people understand? And part of it was just, yes, it's the classic James Bond theory that we have to grab everyone's attention in the first 3 minutes. Otherwise, they won't stick around for the rest. But it was also, this is a point. This is a brutal murder that in any other circumstances, these would be the villains. And yet they are not. They are people who are doing this in service to what they see as the most honorable cause. They are crossing a line that the X-Men are sworn not to cross. We will not kill. Well, they'll do it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why a lot of it's interesting because when Marvel just republished the graphic novel with the intro and extra that Brent and I did, the new pages, they had trouble with the seminal scenes in the middle, where, because Kitty uses a word that has become significantly politically incorrect 38 years after we did the original story. And I had a long discussion with Marvel over that. And it's like, okay, we'll let you do that, but we can't let you have the Hispanic drug guys do their scene. We've got to modify that a little. And I thought, okay. And the irony is, what happened was, when they published it, it was N with the rest of it blacked out. So you could kind of figure out what they're saying, but in the original, we actually said it. And there are, Louise Simonson and I discussed it back then. It wasn't there for fun.
Right.
It was me trying to convey in a primal 13-year-old term from Kitty to her teacher, who is Black, and and she's saying, don't let it bother you that he's just said mutie. Well, in the context of the story, in the context of the X-Men's lives, that is the same word.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why in an issue of New Mutants, where a young mutant commits suicide because he can't see any way out, he's in a world that fears and hates him simply because he exists. And all he can do with his power is make beautiful three-dimensional images. He's an artist. He could have been the next Michelangelo or the next Picasso. And all he can do is kill himself because he's 16 and he can't see a way out. And he doesn't know he has no one to talk to because he's living in a new town and he just doesn't know. And the New Mutants, mistaking his behavior, turn their back on him. It's as much their bad as his. Mm. And at the end, Kitty reads the eulogy and she runs down the list of just about every X-rated word I could get, racial epithet I could come up with solely for that point, is to put this in the equivalent perspective, that mutants are people and you've got to look at them the same way that people look at Hispanics. Some people look at Hispanics, some people look at Blacks, some people look at Muslims, at indigenous peoples. You run down the list, gay, straight, whatever. If you don't look at the person and accept the person and relate to the person, if you just relate to the label, nothing good can come of that. And what I was trying to do is say, okay, in these stories, and God Loves, it's in your face. And it has to be in your face because you have to make a decision which side you're on, and then figure out what you're going to do next. And that's why it comes, I mean, the implication at the end of the story is the police officer kills Stryker. Of course, I brought him back, but that's a whole different, it only took like 35 years.
Comics.
I wanted to come, the whole point was I wasn't going to bring him back until I came up with a story that I thought would almost be on that level. And I thought I did. But, that's 2 generations later. That's why I said the whole point of God Loves is as I said, if you only read one, this is it. Because it's a conflict both on a societal level, a thematic level, and a deeply personal level. And everybody has to make choices in the story. And the most important at the end is, what side of the line do you stand on? And this is why Scott ends up being the hero. Not because he leads the team, but because he says to Charles, you set a standard for us. You showed us what we should do, not what we can do, what we should do, and therefore how we can achieve it. And it's your fault. We're going to hold you to that standard. And Charlie has to go, oh, golly, because he wants to go with Magneto. He's at that point broken because he never expected Stryker to get that deep into his head that fundamentally.
So
which is why I got so pissed off at X2, but that's a whole different stuff.
Thank you for that beautiful answer. So it's just 5 after 8. So I think what we're going to do is this. No, please. We love it. That's why we invited you to come.
I talk too much.
No, you don't.
No such thing.
What I'm going to do is encourage the students and the audience to please go ahead and submit questions. At the moment, I understand we don't have questions from the audience. So I'm going to invite Eric to ask a question.
Sorry.
No. You're laying out truth here.
Great.
They're letting it percolate. But Eric, please go ahead. And if Amelia, lets me know that we've got questions, and I'll try to move on to student questions. So Eric, please.
Okay.
But they're watching Law and Order.
So you may have touched on some of this already in your answers, but you wrote this story back in 1983, and sadly, the anti-mutant rhetoric that's used by Stryker and his followers is very similar to political rhetoric being used today against immigrants, refugees, and members of other minority groups in the country. So if you had to pick one lesson that any person in this time were to pick up and read your book, what would that be?
Well, see, that's one lesson. I mean, I know what my instinctive answer is. You read the book because they're cool people having a great time and it's a lot of fun. You read the book because you fall, for the same reason I write it, you fall in love with the characters. And if you fall in love with them, you follow them through thick and thin, through good and bad, through ups and downs. I can come up with another 5 cliches. It's because when you look at the characters, look at the things that they actually do in a lot of cases, there's a moment way towards the end where Wolverine, when they're in Australia, he's left crucified to an X. You know, the villains nail him to this X cross, and they're just going to see if he can, you know, wait for him to see how long it'll take him to not live, or just agonizingly decay. And eventually he pulls himself loose, but all this is happening while he's being watched by Jubilee, who's like barely 13. She's Kitty's age when Kitty joined. And at the end of the story, he looks at her and says, "You gonna help me or what?" And the subtext of that is what he's doing is totally cruel. If a villain did it, you would think, ugh. He is drafting her into this life. He is getting her to fall in love with this life because he desperately needs her help. And he knows what he's doing. He knows that he is perhaps destroying her future. And he may care, but it doesn't stop him, because from his perspective, there's something far more important and far more material at stake. They are not icons. They make mistakes. They make regrettable decisions. And that's life. We fuck up. Sorry.
All good.
And we have to deal with, we muck up. There, you can dub it. And have to deal with the consequences. And it, again, it's trying to find ways. It's not people running around in wonderfully form-fitting costumes who never have to worry about weight or hunger or anything else, but through that, trying to find a way to build links, resonances to the lives and feelings of the readers. When Kurt, you know, Nightcrawler and Logan are best friends, and there comes a point where he just says, "All right, if you're so cool, walk down the street." Okay, without the image inducer. What? Show these people who you really are and see what happens next. Or are you afraid? I mean, and the reason why I wanted to do this scene with Nightcrawler is because of all the team, he is the most Christian. Mm-hmm. He is a person of faith. Always has been, always will be. Why is the rationale? Well, I've looked like this from the day I was born. Either I'm a demon, which is stupid, or I'm a person. If I'm a person, I was created in the image of God. Or at least God decided this is how I should look. I can either have an argument with the creator, or I can assume there's a reason for it and just keep going. but I will not, as a consequence of how I look, lose my faith, because to him it is that seminal a moment of his being. And it's, for me, I always thought it was cool. And he does walk down the street and people do react, and everybody gets over it, because half of them think it's a guy in costume and the other half are just like, eek, and run away. And then the third half are like, wow, that's cool. But it's not the crowd from Frankenstein running up and saying, burn him, burn him, burn him. That's back in the age I wrote it, it was too cliche. Obviously, the 21st century is,
It's a little darker.
well, I was going to say a little more cliche.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's as someone once said, you know, no, never mind.
No, that's all good. What we're going to do now, thank you for that fantastic answer. And we're going to move on to some audience questions. Amelia?
Yes, so I am going to present first a question from Trinity. Trinity's question is, what is your opinion on writing diverse characters you don't share the same experiences as, like white writers writing persons of color characters or heterosexual writers writing LGBTQ characters? How do you navigate those murky waters, knowing someone might be offended if you do something wrong?
I think the part of the, I think, draw a measure of exception to the term do something wrong, because that applies to any character in any situation. My basic idea is I go by the people I know and have known, and if that actually encompass a fair breadth of experience, and hope for the best. It's not trying to think of people as labels. It's trying, at least for me, it's trying to think of people as people, and then take a further step to see where these aspects of themselves become necessary or integral to the story. From my perspective, I don't know, the people are people. It's who they love, how they relate to the world, how the world relates back to them, grow out of the events that they encounter in the space of the moment, the progress of the story. I have rarely looked on it as, how does this gay character do A, B, and C? It's, how does this character work through the moments of the story? Is what is integral to the story, what is not? I know that's probably not a satisfactory answer. It's just, I guess the cheating answer is no more or no less than whatever William Shakespeare did to imagine life in ancient Rome or in Italy or anywhere else. You just look at the people, look at the circumstances, look at where their feelings, their existence within the dramaturgy lead to the choices they need to make, and what the consequences of those decisions will have on them and the people around them.
Teresa, did you have something you wanted to add to this question?
I accidentally hit the button that I wasn't supposed to hit.
Oh, okay.
I wanted to, I was looking at the next question, and if you don't mind, I'd like to read that because I have something sort of related to it. It's the one
Sure.
from the anonymous attendee. And so the question is, do you believe that regardless of the division that exists in the 21st century USA, that your book is relatable to people of all political positions and viewpoints and all experiences? Is it all things to all people? Both that those of oppressed folks and those who oppress others. And my sort of connection to that is this idea of the you mentioned that it's a story of difference, right? And I think that's very true, but it's also the story of the perception of difference. And that's really important because there's difference, like we're all different, we come from different places, we have things in common, but then there's the perception of difference as other. And it's in that othering that we find the conflict. So I relate to this question and sort of present it to you with a little bit of a slant in terms of audience and 21st century relatability. You know, how do you see that for this an 80s audience and a 90s audience versus a 21st century audience? Do you see that as, you know, how do you see the changes in that?
Well, in the beginning, fatal 3 words, the dynamic was, we always figured there were maybe 100, give or take, active alpha mutants in the world. Magneto, Charlie, the X-Men, the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, yada, yada. In a world of 5 billion people, 100 is not a big deal. Even allowing for the fact that Magneto by himself could probably destroy or recreate the world. But when in the aughts, Grant Morrison came up with multiplying the mutant population 1,000-fold, and the X-Men went public, the school went public. My argument against it was, if you do this, that is a game changer you can never step back from. Instead of having this oppressed minority, again, in a world of humans, you've turned this into what could more popularly be viewed as Cro-Magnon versus Neanderthal.
Mhm.
It's no longer a fight for equality because the mutants have won. Humanity it's like it or not, there's no way, the minute you have thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of mutants, everyone else is just, it's a matter of time before they all go away, because it's survival of the dominant species, and mutants at that point in that future are dominant.
So we've got more audience questions coming in, but before we go to the audience, I got to give all the panelists the opportunity to tell us your favorite X-Men character. All right, all I need, I'm just going to say your name, tell everybody who your favorite X-Men character is. I don't think I'd be in trouble if I didn't allow that to happen. So, we're going to start, and I'm just going to go around my screen. We're going to start with Stanford, favorite X-Men character. Oh, you're muted, Stanford.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
It's a tie between Cyclops and Nightcrawler.
Okay, Teresa.
So I mentioned Mystique. From what little I know, I just love the abilities that she has and the cool movie version. However, I do also like Rogue. I like the way she's drawn. That's how my gray hair is coming in a streak.
There you go.
We're
How
both-
about you, Eric?
Stanford stole my thunder. It's a tie between Cyclops and Nightcrawler for me.
How about you, Victor?
So I can tell you who's not my favorite. I'm from Columbus, Ohio, and we don't do that Wolverine thing around here. This is Buckeye country, so we don't do that. But no, my favorite character will always be Remy LeBeau Gambit.
Fantastic.
Which is cool because I'm
Fantastic.
writing a Gambit story as we speak.
And
think
I'm
you-
buying it now, guaranteed.
I think you just stole Leandra's.
I'm
favorite
sorry.
character.
I'm sorry. Leandra, that's why we're friends.
That's
I
right.
know.
Well, I think the
See?
active word is we're friends.
Do you have an alternative or a tie?
Okay, so Gambit is my favorite, but I do like his relationship, like his tete-a-tete with Rogue that he has a lot. So I'll go with Rogue. I loved her in the Saturday morning cartoon. She was the best. She was the wittiest. So
Yeah. So guys, I got to go with Nightcrawler #1, and
Cool.
I got to go Gambit 1.5. I just loved the light that Nightcrawler brought to that world, and really presented religion in the way I think people sort of meant it to be presented. So, Amelia, would you go ahead and give us the next student question?
I will. I have to add as,
Oh yeah, please.
because I know I'm not a panelist, but this is my one moment to say it, is that as someone who was just a few years younger than Kitty Pryde when she was introduced as a character, and who trekked to Calumet City, Illinois, which is just slightly away from Deerfield, where Kitty is from, I have related to Kitty Pryde my entire life. She is just absolutely all-time favorite comic book character, not just X-Men. So with that, Kelly has a question. How, if at all, has the changing nature of our society and environment, like changing rights and representation of marginalized groups, impacted how certain characters are created, portrayed, or looked back on after their creation?
I can't speak for new characters or how they're being dealt with in the current run because I have very little to do with it. The interesting thing is there have been rumored discussions about how Marvel Studios might approach the Xavier Magneto dichotomy for current audiences. There's, I think one rumor was having them both be more African, just to, I think, no, sorry, my brain's gone south, but
Oh, good.
and the problem is that Magneto has the awkward aspect of being anchored to a seminal moment in human history that can't be easily erased without, or forgotten without totally throwing him out the window, or his rationale out the window. So that's the challenge. I mean, I think when I started, I suspect Stan might have felt the same way. To say, hey, 70 years from now, we're still going to be reading this stuff, and God help you, you might still be writing this stuff. What do you think? The world has gone in weird directions. The challenges and choices the characters face have gone in weird directions. I think, like any author or any writer, if you toss me a line that says this is the fundamental parameter of the world, my first reaction would be, okay, how can I get around it?
Right.
How can I, what are the cracks in the system that I can play with? Who is the more interestingly marginalized? If Charlton Heston jumps up and says Soylent Green are people. Okay, what happens next? I mean, I think the thing you have to bear in mind is, at least from my perspective, the most important or the most natural question is presented with any moment of any issue. My first reaction is always, okay, what happens next? You know, okay, Luke and Leia and Han have won the war. Yay! What happens next? Okay, another emperor is coming and another emperor. What happens next? This is ideally an ongoing serial adventure. The kids keep growing up. Years and years ago, Jim Lee and I had this dumb idea. Hey, let's have Betsy wake up and she's suddenly Asian. We'll do it for 3 issues and then put her back the way she was. Oddly enough, the readers really loved it. So we kept going. And then 25 years later, somebody said, hey, let's make her back the way she was. And my reaction was, screw you. She looks cool this way. If you make her back the way she was, she's just another tall white chick. Meaning no disrespect. We do have a number of them. The interesting thing about playing with, I mean, my attitude was, okay, we've got New Mutants from these countries and Excaliburs from these countries and X-Men from these countries. But what about all the ones that are left? Because the more diversity I can bring into the stories, the more I have to go out and learn about the places that they come from and the people that are there and the questions they might ask coming here and the challenges that might be thrown at them as a result. I mean, it began occurring to me a long time ago that the X canon are the biggest collection of illegal aliens you've ever seen, up to and including for gosh sakes.
I'll tell you what.
Never mind.
It's all
this
good.
is when old fart brain goes to town.
No, it's all good. We have just a few minutes left. So what I want to do is this. I'm going to ask if Sean Thornton is in the house. And if Sean Thornton is in the house, could you say so in the chat? I'd like to bring you in just for a second if you're here.
Sean is in the house. We will try and promote him to a pass. There he
look
is.
at that. He just jumped up, didn't he? Chris, this is Sean Thornton. This is the guy doing all the artwork, advertising this stuff. And this X-Men poster just blew me away. So I thought I would just give him an opportunity to tell you how much he enjoyed working on it. And you get to see who he is because, man, it's what he does. So, that's Sean, cool. You got to unmute.
Archer. Hey, guys. How's it going?
Hello.
Thanks, thanks for having me join in. Yeah, it was a tremendous pleasure to draw professionally in the limited sense that I can, the characters that, I first got into comics with and first fell in love with, and especially, with your writing with the Dark Phoenix saga, I believe is where I started out. So yeah, it was an immense pleasure.
So Sean sent the poster and I said, dude, can you put a Nightcrawler on it? He said, well, of course I can. So he puts a Nightcrawler on it. And the next day he posts on Facebook, I did a Nightcrawler. So obviously this was on his bucket list. So Sean, thanks for all the great work you do on this. And we just appreciate just the love and care that you put into these flyers. We have one more question. It's an easy question. It's from Tyler Emkin. Amelia, could you please read that last simple question?
Yes, I can. Tyler's question is, was Gambit supposed to be the third Summers brother?
Oh, God, no.
Oh, no.
That's Adam X, y'all. Adam X is the third Summers brother. I'm sorry. It's so terrible.
I'm sorry. What?
So terrible. Yeah, that just came out actually.
Yeah,
Yeah, I know.
Okay, 30 seconds. See if I can do this. Originally, okay, how can I do this really fast? Be patient.
Take your time.
In the
Don't do it
beginning,
fast.
we had a villain named Mr. Sinister.
Mhm.
He was a badass. He had all these really mean supervillains working for him, and he's responsible for the mutant massacre.
Mhm.
Okay, cut back 10 more years. Scott's in an orphanage. He has a good friend. His only friend in the orphanage is this creepy little kid. Well, the creepy little kid, in my concept, is Sinister. He is a
Wow.
mutant whose lifespan is more than 1,000 years, but he ages physically, he ages proportionately. So yes, he was born in the early middle 1800s. And now by the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st, he looks like he's what, 10 years old. Well, as far as he is a brilliant intellect and evil as they come. But he's not an idiot. He's not stupid. He knows no self-respecting Marvel supervillain will take orders from a 10-year-old kid. Or as I like to say, this is not the Justice League. So he built himself a simulacrum, a false face, to be the mastermind. But bear in mind, he's a 10-year-old kid. So what he builds is Mr. Sinister. Because if you actually look at Mr. Sinister, there's no credibility whatsoever. He looks like a 10-year-old kid's vision of what a supervillain will look like.
Mm,
You know, I mean, give me a break. Even I am not that stupid.
that's fantastic.
But
Go,
well,
please,
no,
go ahead.
just to finish off.
No, please.
So the idea was, after the X-Men had beaten him a number of times, he wanted to find a way in. So he clones himself. Remy is Sinister when Sinister is 23.
Wow.
Mhm.
And the idea was he was supposed to infiltrate the X-Men, his target would be Kitty, because Kitty is the core of the next generation. Which I have, you know, the Rogue thing came after I got fired the first time.
Mm,
So
go ahead.
and then over time, Gambit would evolve to the point where he didn't like being a slave, busted free, and started defining his own life as a hero, which clearly made Sinister upset, you know, and that would be the core of their rivalry for the next umpty bump years. Unfortunately, Marvel and I came to a parting of the ways, yada, yada, yada. And having no idea of my plans, one of the Brits, he wrote a story of Mr. Sinister in the 1800s, you know, and the rest is history. So I actually like my idea much better, but
Yeah, I do too. I'm sorry.
I do too. Now
Yeah.
I'm reading Gambit and I'm like, oh.
Right?
So
but
while we have
they're living happily ever after.
So while we have Sean in the house, I want you guys to get ready for the big reveal for the flyer for next month's. This is just off the hook.
Oh, nice.
Oh, that's very cool.
So please
Thank you.
please come back next month when we celebrate Asian Pacific Heritage Month with a discussion of the only Hayao Miyazaki's Princess Mononoke.
Oh, I have loved Miyazaki since
the first viewing.
No, actually since his Lupin the Third, Lupin
Yeah.
13. Lupin Third, sorry.
No, it's all good.
Miyazaki is just absolutely brilliant in imagination, in execution, in just about everything. I mean,
I love it. I would argue he's, and I'm going over time as well, but I think he's probably one of the top 3 best story writers we have alive right now. I mean, storytelling, it's just unbelievable. So look, it's a little bit after 8:30 Central Time, and unfortunately, we have to bring tonight's panel to a close. Again, thanks to all of you for attending. Thanks to our special guest, especially Mr. Claremont, for coming. We'll see you next month at our ReggieCon panel, where we're going to talk about Princess Mononoke. So thank you for coming, and we'll see you next time.